This is a story that doesn't directly relate to just the Twin Cities, so I was hesitant about bringing it to you. But because it's, I think, interesting and because it does overlap with this area, I wanted to let you know what's going on down towards the Iowa border. But first, I want to mention something about archaeology. How many of you have ever been on an archaeological site in Minnesota? Visited an archaeological site in Minnesota? A few. Oh, good. Yeah, not necessarily on a dig. No, I didn't expect that. Any of you ever take archaeology in college? Ah, good. Be sure to come up with some good questions then. All right. To begin with, the story of archaeology in Minnesota is the story of how we look for the human remains, the remains that human beings have left behind, not just human remains, but the actual cultural, material cultural artifacts that are left behind. And those are usually stone or bone, sometimes charcoal. Later on in time, they developed pottery. We look for pottery. And that's how we put together the stories of what happened in the past. So we're looking, as you know, sifting through soil and using the evidence that we can find to make interpretive guesses at what happened. We never know for sure. We're always making hypotheses and guessing at what was happening. But we've been able to put together a few things about the first people in Minnesota. They were here about 13,000 years ago, after the last glacial expression came down, the Des Moines lobe, and as the Des Moines lobe was receding and melting, it exposed landscape that then became available for animals, and wherever there were animals, there were people. People came in and hunted. At that time, as you know, there were, because these are famous, there were mastodon and mammoth, and these large critters were, you'd think, not easy to bring down, but they would use fire and waving blankets and figure out a way to isolate one from a herd and get it into a swamp like this. This is a very realistic depiction of what it takes to hunt like this. You don't just chase them down with spears, you get them where they're completely vulnerable, and then take it from there. If you were to kill a big beast like this, you'd put a camp next to it, and because it would last, well, it would last for months and months as a food source, but it would also take weeks to harvest the entire critter. And they used lots of the body parts, almost all of the body parts, to skin the hide, to take the tusks, to make the tools they needed for everyday life. In addition to which, they used stone tools, like the guy over on the lower right here, who, if you can see my cursor, but anyway, on the lower right here, who is making a stone tool, a spear point, and the guy next to him is whittling down stone to make a new tool. They had, of course, fire, and so we find sometimes the evidence of that. But what you see here is just a fraction of what their lifestyle was. Of course they hunted smaller animals. Of course they ate plants and took advantage of fish in the waters and such. But they were the first people on the landscape, and that period, what we call the Paleo-Indian period, lasted about 3,000 years. 3 to 4,000 years. And then by 8,000 years ago, we're in a new phase of how people responded to cultural change, to climate change, and that is cultural change. They responded in such a way that they created new traditions and created new toolkits to exploit different parts of the environment that weren't there before. Out on the prairie, they had bison, but the bison were huge. Antique, bison antiquus was one that are now extinct, and provided, again, food like the bison or like the mammoth and mastodon did, which were long gone by now. But the landscape was completely different. And again, it's a story of climate change. Clearly things warmed up after the glaciers left, and now that there's prairie, then there's another few thousand years of the prairie becoming moist and then eventually becoming deciduous woodland, and then finally the landscape as it is closer to modern times about 1,000 years ago. So that whole story that we think about it is in our minds in 4 big chunks: the Paleo-Indian, and then these other 3, the Archaic and the Woodland and the Mississippi. And I won't go through them all, but I just wanted to say that these are all stories of people responding to a changing landscape and responding to it by changing the way in which they do things, the food they eat, the plants they harvest, and the way they go about procuring them, and then how they live together. And so it's people moving around a lot. By the woodland time that you see there, which is about only 1,000 years, they are living in smaller communities and that are growing in population, but they are communities in specific places, and that wasn't true before. And then finally, by the Mississippian, we get even more change I'll mention in a minute. But what they all have in common, every phase, and that's part of why I brought all this up, is that for the entire 11,000 years, every single adult, no matter who they were or where they were, had a piece of chert in their pocket. So chert is this hard stone that you can manipulate. You can carve it. You can make it into a stone tool. You can make knives or spear points or an awl for punching holes in leather. You can use it for making scrapers to get that hide ready to become leather that you can use. Every single thing, chopping down a tree. They needed chert for a number of different tools that were significant to their daily lives, and everybody had one. I have one in my pocket right now as a pocket knife. Everybody did back then. And there are different kinds of chert. There's a lot of different kinds of chert in Minnesota. I'm going to tell you about only one, but there are 32 different kinds of chert in Minnesota. You can see by this small array, they come in some different colors, and they were used in different ways over the years. Chert comes from the water, the oceans that came over Minnesota, in southern Minnesota in particular, over hundreds of millions of years. We had oceans in the southern part of the state that reached up to about the Twin Cities, about the Minnesota River Valley. And as those waters came up and were there, billions of little critters with shells died and sank to the bottom. And that muck at the bottom with all those shells kept building up and building up. And over hundreds of millions of years, that there was pressure that finally fused those into limestone. So these are the limestone scenes you see as you drive down the highway. And you see these layers. You can tell that each of those layers represents a different point in time of water coming in and going out, and these thousands of years of deposits for each layer. And that's where chert is found. But when those waters completely go away, in fact, let me show you the waters. Here's what it looked like. This is the Devonian period, 385 million years ago, when southern Minnesota was underwater. You can see where the rest of the land masses that existed at that time are here. But if you notice, all of that water you see in this image is exactly where we find the cherts in Minnesota. They pretty much all come from that part. Now, there's some from a little bit further north that represent a different period of time than the Devonian, so they do exist in other places, but this is where a big chunk of those 32 that I mentioned come from. And they're found in these layers. So you see that, in between layers. And the reason that's there that way is there'd be an ocean that came in and left sort of a tidal pool as it went out. And the tidal pool would sit there for a few thousand years, and different critters would come in. Not shells this time, but their exoskeletons had silica. And the silica is like glass. And the silica left behind eventually comes together as microcrystals. And those crystals harden, they become crystallized. And as they do, they grow little chunks of stone. What becomes stone, it's just like a fifth grade science class where you have crystals that you get to form in a glass and watch the magic happen. Well, these happened that way, and they happened with some limitations, so they're not growing forever. But those chunks we call nodules of chert can be seen some places in southern Minnesota. In this case, you can see this line of chert in here, and what happened was that chert had time to form, and then another ocean came in and laid down another whole layer of limestone above it. So you get that kind of sequencing happening for creating the chert, and then you can see that it just leaks out of the walls. Now, if you're a Native American 7,000 to 8,000 years ago and you're walking along trying to figure out where your chert's going to come from, instead of trying to go through all the work of chipping it out of this rock, you'd look down below for rock that's eroded. You'd be walking along stream beds like in southeastern Minnesota, where you've got really tall stream beds with lots of limestone like this, kind of eroding different layers of cherts that would be found at the bottom. So you just pick them up out of the stream bed. And that's where the majority of chert came from for the first 12,000 years. The need for chert was completely met by all of those. The other way in which you can find chert in the Minnesota landscape is some of those previous glaciers brought down with them from Canada cherts in this jumble of rocks they brought. And then when they were depositing themselves, and as they melted and went away, there were some giant till piles that had chert in it, and that's another place that Native Americans would discover and pass on for generations as a source of chert. So they shared these stories so people knew where to go. The exception to that story of how Chert was found is the Grand Meadow Chert Quarry. It's on the headwaters of the Root River, to get you located geographically about where it is here. And you can see there it's in southeastern Minnesota. Those are the 3 counties that meet Iowa at the bottom, the 3 bottom tier counties. And then the Root River is the big stream to the right, and these are all tributaries going into the Root. Got a question?
Where's Austin? Because that's what I think of from up Mower.
So the question is, where's Austin? It's just to the southeast of the M in Mower, just off a little bit, southwest, sorry, a little bit over to the west of that. So it's in the very western part of Mower County. And I don't mind being interrupted with questions if I can see them, so feel free. And here's another better way to show you the answer to your question. So there's Austin in relation to the Grand Meadow Chert Quarry. And there are a number of other cities I wanted to just help you figure out where we are here so you can see where it is in relation to Rochester. It's about 25 miles south of Rochester, about 20 miles east of Austin. But the Root River is the main body of water through all that, and that, as you know, is the driftless zone. And so the exposure there of the limestone walls through millions of years of erosion is pretty impressive, and therefore at the bottom of the Root River are a lot of different kinds of chert you could find, and pretty much covered what people needed. The same thing happened here and along the South Bear Fork Creek, the South Fork of Bear Creek, which is running right there, and in the dry summer, you can still today find chert nodules in it. The place I'm going to talk about is that green woods that you can see in this aerial view from Google. That green woods is the Grand Meadow Chert Quarry Preserve. That's the only part of it that's been preserved. And that was something that was the source of this particular gray chert that we knew about, but we had no idea where it came from until the guy in the upper left-hand corner, Maynard Green, persisted in finding an archaeologist to come down and see it. He wrote a letter in 1952. He got the lead archaeologist in Minnesota to finally answer and come down to see what he was so excited about. He said he had an ancient Indian quarry, and Lloyd Wilford drove down in the morning and wanted to see what Maynard had. Maynard had so many sites that he was so proud of. He needed to show this archaeologist some other places first and save the best for last. So they went around to different sites that Maynard wanted to show off to the professor, and then had lunch. And after lunch, Lloyd Wilford looked up and saw the storm clouds coming and said, "I got to get back to town." And he hopped in his car and never came back. So no archaeologist had been there until my field partner and I went, because the archaeologist in 1979, when I was the field director for the statewide archaeological survey, the state archaeologist at that time handed me Maynard's letter and said, "Would you please go talk to this guy? He's been waiting a long time." So 30 years later, I show up. And I showed up with my field partner, and this is my field partner, Lee Radzak, who, if any of you have been to Split Rock, spent the last 35 years running Split Rock Lighthouse and just retired. But that's Lee in the landscape that just startled us so much. I mean, we hadn't seen anything like this. Maynard was kind of coy and waiting to see if we figured it out, what it was, because it actually, the local neighbors thought so, looked like a World War I bombing range. You know, like small explosives had kept happening and happening and happening, and then these were the exploded, backfill piles of exploded dirt that went out. And that's what it looked like, but when we looked outside, and we didn't think it was that, but when we looked outside, the landscape in the plowed fields was just absolutely littered with rock, and almost all of that rock you're looking at involves pieces of chert or the little brown bit of limestone that's around one of those nodules I talked about. That's called a cortex. And the cortex was also visible in that shot as the brown, like over in that left-hand corner. You can see a big piece of it sticking out of the soil. So we knew we had something special. We knew it was certainly unique in Minnesota, and that it was a open pit quarry mine that someone had made where they had dug holes. We knew that they had dug those holes by hand. Native Americans had done it because we saw the materials outside and some of the artifacts that Maynard showed us made of that stone. And we recognized the gray stone because it had been a puzzle to archaeologists for many years. Everybody had said that in the reports of the time when they'd run into that chert from this quarry, they would instead say they thought it came from Iowa. and just leave it at that. Nobody ever identified where it had come from. So we wanted to sort of introduce this idea to our colleagues the next year at a paper I gave in Mankato, and we needed to come up with a thesis. We needed to have a hypothesis about what was going on here. You know, why were these holes dug? Who dug them? Why are they preserved to this day? So those were the questions that were on our mind as we went and looked at it. Now, people had found, as I mentioned, chert like this. This is the oldest Grand Meadow chert artifact, and I have to call it an artifact and be careful because it was once a spear point, and then it got reused, and now it's asymmetrical, and instead it became a knife, probably on a shorter handle. And so that happened commonly, that artifacts made of good quality chert would be continually resharpened until they disappeared, or they would be resharpened until they had to be repurposed into a different kind of artifact. And then we found Grand Meadow chert throughout since those 13,000 years. This is probably about 5,000 years ago. So we knew about it, and that's it, and that we knew it was once we had it. But what happened was all of the chert in all of those archaeological excavations throughout the state, 52 counties, we found Grand Meadow chert in 52 counties. All of it could be accounted for by the amount of chert you could find on your own just by walking the stream beds nearby and finding nodules. There's still some in this picture. Today, you can still walk this stream, that's the South Fork of Bear Creek, and you can pick up these nodules. So we had to come up with a hypothesis of why did this happen, and what does this all mean? And part of the answer came from just looking at a topo map. So this is a USGS topo map, a standard tool for us in archaeology, so that we can read the landscape without even getting out of the car. But in this case, it helped us understand that at 1290, the creek bed there was where the chert bed was, but probably a little higher, and the creek bed had cut through it. And that's why you see the nodules just lying around. They had been disposed by the passing water in the moving creek bed, and that people would come along and take it. Well, at some point, that wasn't good enough. At some point, they got out, we think, and started digging holes, because we saw that there were possibly holes all over the place as we looked at this. And as they went up from the land down below at 1290 and went up to 1300 and 1310 and up into what is the woods now of 1310 up to 1320, they were digging bigger holes and deeper holes. And at some point, somebody figured out that it wasn't going to work. So if you look, this is the South Fork of Bear Creek, looking from the south, looking to the north towards the site. And if you look at it, you can see that the landscape is kind of angling up, and that's why those holes got deeper. Well, they were so deep by the time they got up to that level that the farmers coming in the 1880s couldn't, with a horse and plow, fill those holes in and convert them to plowland or into a cemetery. Now, they could in the slightly shallower landscape, but way up in there, they couldn't. And the farmers that came in the 1900s and could have done it, this guy decided not to. This is a farm family that is still there since 1919, and they get all the credit in the world for having saved this land. But what we also knew was that as we walked these fields all around, there was probably about 2,000 of these holes, we thought. And the reason we figured that out is the other key to my telling this story to my colleagues at Mankato in 1981 was that I was able to find an air photo. Didn't have Google maps to use at the time. So I went over to the map library at the university and I looked through all the air photos. And it turned out that the 1968 air photo that showed our place, which right there, also showed the place across the road where, again, the pits had been so deep they'd been left for decades. And then the farmer in 1968 picked the moment right before this air flight to cut his trees and expose the pits that were in his woods. And this was right before he got around to filling them out. So you can see this is the same pattern that actually we have inside our woods. We have 90 to 100 pits in that little 8 acres you're looking at. And so they're this densely compacted. And when I showed this to my archaeological colleagues, there was a gasp in the room. It was really fun. But the point is that it just gave us, again, a reassurance that when we were walking these fields and looking at such densities and assuming we were walking above plowed in, covered over pits, and not just random distribution of chert that had been used and dropped on the ground, but instead was all of the debris from the labor of digging the chert in the pits was being exposed on that surface. And here we had a place where we could say, when we walked it now and it's all plowed in, you could say, well, here's what that looks like. Here's exactly what the kind of chert is and what the density of it is. And we figured out over that landscape how far and wide that distribution went. So we figured out that it was 175 acres. The distribution of how many pits, and from that, there's 2,000 pits at that density that would fit in there. So that's what we're going on. After that, I gave the paper, the Science Museum, the archaeologist there came up, and shortly after that, I moved on to my next career and abandoned this. And Bud Shane, took it over and got the site on the National Register of Historic Places. It was so significant that that happened easily. And then because of that, the Archaeological Conservancy bought it. And they have preserved it in perpetuity for research. I don't think they expected they were preserving it for what we're doing now, but they are a partner with us in what we're doing. I didn't have LiDAR back then, but if I did, it would have helped. This is what that site looks like if you take away all the vegetation. LiDAR is a trick using light beams instead of radar, instead of sound and radar, and it exposes what the ground looks like without vegetation, which sounds like magic and feels like it to me, but there it is. And that's the density of our pits. And my task was to come in and figure out how to put a trail through there so the public could come visit this site. I thought it was valuable, such a valuable site. It's one of the most valuable sites in Minnesota. Can we possibly share it with the public and do that in a way that isn't putting the site at risk? And I think we're on solid ground doing that, opening it to the public, because all of the landowners are helping protect it for us. The local sheriff is helping protect it for us. We'll have cameras in there. And also there's nothing to take except chert. People who made tools here took them with them, so there's no point in looking for artifacts nearby. The other part of the story, figuring out why are there so many holes? We can figure out now that there were, and that they dug them, and they were so deep, and that's why the woods were there, and that's why the holes are still in the woods. All of that part of the story we figured out. But what needed to be really answered is who did it and why? And in other words, why are there so many? And at even what period? We had no indication. We had no evidence of what time periods we're talking about. You know, was the site, how old was this place where people came and dig holes? And the answer to that question seems to be coming out of this location of this red dot. Anyone want to tell me what that is? Say what? Cahokia. Cahokia is at St. Louis, where the Missouri River there, as you see it, meets the Mississippi and just above where the Ohio River comes in, the American bottomlands. And there is where there is the largest mound. This is, in fact, the source of this final phase, is the Mississippian phase, really is directly tied to Cahokia. And Cahokia is the source of this enormous mound, the largest such mound in the hemisphere. It's bigger than any of the pyramids in Mexico or South America. And it's millions, literally, of baskets of dirt built this in a fairly short amount of time, in just a couple hundred years. And its platforms were used as temple sites. And on the very top of it was what looks like a house for a very special person, some kind of a chieftain, for instance. It probably looked like this at its heyday when it was buzzing. And here are people, down below building homes. There's homes within this area close by. The homes may have been for elite, hard to say, because there was also, surrounding the site, evidence of lots of other habitation sites. It's estimated there were 40,000 people, between 30 and 40,000 people living here. From 1000 AD to no more than 1350. So that 350-year span is when people were here, and it suddenly ends. Another story altogether. But it suddenly ends abruptly, and that whole thing, that whole energy going on down there stops. But it was huge at the time, and this is a ball court. Certainly would have been a popular pastime to come and watch the game. I think it would have drawn tourists. People would have gone down in canoes and when they could, and experienced the city and gone back, coming in from all directions. And for that reason, the markets here must have been enormously popular and would have represented people from all over the region. And it feels as though what Cahokia represents is a kind of empire of a cult that had tentacles out into many, many places around the middle of America at the time. We know that, in fact, there was a special group of people from Cahokia who came as far as Trempealeau, Wisconsin, near La Crosse, just opposite the river. So they came up that close into Minnesota, pretty much in the middle of Cahokia's height, and established some temple mounds there. You can go visit them now. There's a walking tour like the one we are creating. And it was apparently a really interesting outpost of folks from Cahokia for just a short amount of time, less than 100 years, but influential and somewhat impactful. Even beyond that, however, was the ongoing influence up the river, and from here up the Mississippi a little bit to where you see the St. Croix and Mississippi come together, and below that at Red Wing, where the Cannon River is. And so that influence kept coming up and circulating, and what that influence was absolutely transitional, absolutely transformative. So what became of, or what came out of Cahokia that really made an impact here in Minnesota included new forms of agriculture. Now, people had probably already figured out how to make hoes for doing small family plots for agriculture, but suddenly there's an abundance of hoes needed for an expanded use of agriculture for a lifestyle for these people. So they're living down on river bottoms. Suddenly they're growing a much better strain of corn. Some corn came in earlier, but now all of a sudden it's corn out of Cahokia, and it's been already developed to be a larger and better corn. And so that's shared with us. And it's in pottery like this that has specific designs to just this Mississippian period. And we suddenly find that everywhere. And the pottery we find at these sites where we know there was some influence from Cahokia has little specks of white in it. Those are shell. That's shell tempering instead of grit tempering that help make the pottery strong. And the handles were bigger, and the pottery was larger, much larger, and it was thin. It was just much, much better made. So the techniques for making these things came and was shared with the people that were living all around the area here in river bottoms, essentially. They changed the way the bow and arrow operated. Before this, you had arrowheads. They're fairly recent. Bow and arrows happened after 800 AD, but 800 BC, excuse me, after 800 BC. But here at about 1080, the arrowheads all get like this, small, triangular, and you see them by the thousands out there in the archaeological record. And they weren't bird points. They're often called that by collectors, but they're actually for hunting deer and any size game. And the other thing that really is a key part of the story is the scraper. This is a scraping tool for cleaning hides. You would take something, they're not very big. I mean, this one in the picture is about yay. It would be used for cleaning hides. We found them, in fact, all over this circle of villages, Blue Earth Valley, along the Blue Earth River, up in Red Wing where the cannon is, over at La Crosse, and down along the Upper Iowa River, which actually starts just over by the Chert Quarry and flows into the Mississippi at the Upper Iowa location there in the map. All of these villages have in common that after 1000 AD, they suddenly have an extraordinary number of scrapers, which is not easily explained. It's more scrapers than they need for their population, as we estimate it, but they are obviously making more hides than they need. So it looks as though there's kind of an economic impact of Cahokia going on, where we think that the vast number of scrapers needed was in order to fuel a trading relationship with Cahokia. And we don't see exactly what Cahokia was trading back physically, but it may have been in the form of cloth or food and in other ways, things that we don't see in the archaeological record. But this is a hint to us from all those villages around that probably their need for chert and their use of chert from this chert quarry was being driven by Cahokia. The other thing is, again, the story of the chert quarry doesn't happen at the chert quarry. It happens at all these other places, because when we go to the Blue Earth Valley or up to Red Wing, where the Bryan site is, we see extraordinary numbers. 90% of all scrapers in blue there are Grand Meadow chert scrapers at these sites between 1000 and 1350 AD. In fact, they spread much further. This is a scraper that was found inside what is now Fort Snelling. It was found under one of the buildings when they were excavating a few years ago. And of course, that point above the river would have been a grand place to have a campsite, but usually a scraper implies a longer occupation. So there may have actually been a village we haven't really found up in that area, which would have been a terrific location. When you take one of those scrapers, you attach it to a handle like this so that you can use it and put more leverage on it than you would with your fingers. And this is an image that we've had prepared for our interpretive program of a Dakota woman cleaning a hide. And of course, usually this would be done with 3 women at once, and it would be a bit of a social thing for them, helping each other with hides. But we wanted you to be able to see what was going on there and how that hafted point was used, or edge was used to scrape the hides. Of course, you only scrape one side of the hide if you want the fur to be a part of a blanket, but if you're making anything else like a teepee or a shield or a drum skin or clothing, you would scrape both sides. And usually bison hide clothing is too cumbersome to wear. These women are probably wearing deer hide clothing in this image. The other thing about the buffalo, too, is that as we were going out into the plains, in all of those places I showed you had access to buffalo herds and probably got together in order to go hunting together in order to better exploit the herds that were out there. Millions of buffaloes, you've heard, or bison. And so we're trying to tell that story at the Quarry site, and this is one of the signs we're having developed, using that painting down in the corner, the actual painting, not just that sketch. And you can see that we're also doing all our signage in Dakota and English. And we're working with the Prairie Island Indian community to do that. And they've been helping to guide us in the content of all the signs we've created. But you'll also notice that we have that little box up there about all the uses of the buffalo. And you've got innumerable, this is just a short list of all the different ways in which body parts were converted to useful tools for daily living by native peoples. True back 10,000 years earlier, especially true now, because some of these things were probably done with the extra bodies they were harvesting to go into that economic exchange system. In other words, the folks down at Cahokia had exhausted all the bison herds around them, and so they needed the outlying communities to send things to them, either as tribute or in trade. So to final point about the quarry itself, how were these dug? These holes are huge. You can tell that this is it's an enormously wide one. It's also an enormously deep one. This is probably one of the last pits dug in the quarry. But if you'll think about it, that's a lot of work. And so what we think happened, based on some research done at a similar place in North America that was about 40 years ahead of us in research, and they've come up with some great answers and found more things because they've done a lot of excavation. They probably started by cutting the sod. We're on a prairie, so they had to cut the sod, probably with a Chert knife, ironically maybe a Grand Meadow Chert knife. Cut the initial sod, and then use a digging stick like the guy has on the right, and to use the stick to chop the dirt loose. And then someone else would have one of those bison scapula hoes I've been showing you, made out of the backbone of a buffalo, and they would scrape the loose dirt as things went into baskets, and there'd be a whole line of people with baskets. We don't know if it was women or kids or who it was, but they would be coming in a daisy chain and getting the baskets out of the ever-deepening hole and putting that dirt around each hole. And that's why we get this, effect of the landscape being so rolled and almost not flat anywhere. It's flat in a couple of places. The places where it's flat, we're assuming, and we have to prove this, were all places where people, instead of putting more dirt on the edge of their pit and risking that dirt to fall in, started filling in last year's pit or someone else's pit, an abandoned pit. And I think that happened in quite a few places in the quarry, and we're really eager to look inside one of those, because that's where they also would have thrown their trash. What they're digging for at the bottom of, and we are, I don't know if you know this, but archaeologists are really glorified trash collectors. That's really who we are and what we do. So we're eager to find the debris from everyday living in the bottom of a hole like that. What they were looking for in the bottom of this hole were those nodules, and that's what those are down below. The chunks of Grand Meadow chert that came out of the ground there. They looked like this, sometimes smaller, but this is what it looks like. They take that out of the ground and hand it up to somebody sitting up on the edge. That's what these look like, by the way, in the ground. This is where the nodules are at the bottom of one of those pits. This is the only excavation that's ever been done. We haven't been doing any digs. This was a test trench dug in 1980 by Radzak and me, and this is what it looked like when we got to the bottom. So we could tell the depth, and we could determine that. Remember, we had a hypothesis about the stuff being flat at a certain height, at 1298 feet above sea level. This verified that, so that's how we know that for sure. But it also showed us how much work it was that they had to go to get through and what was in those backfill piles. Very interesting stuff. So when they got that far with the nodules out of the ground, they'd hand them up to a guy at the top of the pit who had in his hand a stone and had a hammer, which was a hammerstone, and had what we call an anvil stone at his knees in front of him there, and he would put the chert nodule in the middle and crack it open and look at it to see what the quality was. And he'd use a hammerstone like this, and we find a lot of them, and a hammerstone like this, which we have about 5 of these we know about right now in the quarry. There's still so much vegetation in there, we haven't been able to find all of them, but we assume there's about 1 every 3 to 5 pits, because they didn't need one for every pit. They can use somebody else's. But chances are one napper sitting there, flint napper, would be able to serve quite a few different pits at once, handling the stuff coming out from his entire community. A lot of guessing. We don't know exactly how many people were there at any one time and how many came from different villages, etc. But it is obvious that there were these kinds of hammerstones being used. And when he did break open the nodule, they'd check it, as I say, for quality control and determine whether they go on and make something. Now, the 2 I handed you, for some reason they didn't use. So their sense of quality control is pretty astute. And they had pretty much endless chert that they could afford to throw some away and move on. The good stuff gets napped. And so this is a baton made out of a moose antler hitting a piece of Grand Meadow chert to make a scraper. This took my colleague Dan Wendt about 8 minutes to take a rock and make it into a fully fledged chert scraper. And he's just an expert at it, but so were the people who were doing it back then. And this is the kind of then refining work where this is instead a knife, and you keep hitting it to get it down to a particular level of fineness, and then you use a different antler. Finally, you use a deer antler to do the really close work to get a good edge on it. The other thing about this notion of where all that great chert that was out there that no one knew where it was from, they needed to have us tell them how they could be sure that the great chert that they had in their collections or in their excavations were from this quarry. And one of the answers was, and this is from Dan Wendt, you can identify Grand Meadow chert simply because, remember I said these are pools formed in the Devonian 385 million years ago from a particular episode of an ocean coming up and then receding. So that's the only time this stuff was created. And when it was only in this place, but it left behind in those pools that now frozen in these crystallized chunks of rock, specific fossils. And this collection of 3 to 5 specific fossils that you can see with a hand lens tells you immediately that the piece of chert you're looking at is Grand Meadow chert. I hope I've mentioned just how lucky this project has been, but it's been extraordinarily graced by just pure good luck. One of the pieces of good luck is that the Soil and Water Conservation people had this chart of what the geology of Mower County looks like. And they happened to have put the transect to show what the various ocean levels look like right through Grand Meadow. And so we've got this perfect shot of what this looks like in terms of the different colors for ocean layers that are now limestone, and what ours at 385 million years ago looked like the salmon rock in there. And it shows very, very clearly that this angle going out as the waters receded. This chert layer way up at the top on this is at the this expression of the limestone, in fact, is at the very highest possible level. And what's coming in from the left are the glacial deposits from that Des Moines lobe. And as this melt is coming through, it's left soil behind that's still there. And so most of it's too high to get at this layer, except for this one spot, which is the Grand Meadow Chert Quarry. This is perfectly positioned at the only place it could possibly be, which is where the chert is so high it's exposed, and where the glacier debris is so low we can see it. We can get at it. Pure luck. If you take that same view, and I know this is a little mind twist here, but if you look at it from up above and see this, the images of where that remnants of that same limestone layer can be found, you see also that our research area, shown in that dotted layer that shows the 175 acres, that we did find by using our calculation of density on the field, we did find pretty much exactly where the site was. Now, there may be room for a few more pits over to the right where the word bear is looking at, and we're looking at this year. We're looking at that in the coming year. We have a survey with Hamline University going on to help us further extend the parameters of the original chert quarry. I've been lucky in finding Art Kenyon, who is an artist at Red Wing, and he came down to the site and stood on the road with me. This is the gravel road, and to the left is that chert quarry preserve, the woods that I was telling you about, and there's one of the streams through it, and in the background is the South Fork of Bear Creek. So that's the position. We're looking east and slightly south. So I stood there and I said, can you show this with a landscape of pits as it would have looked in the first 50 years, right around 1050 AD or so, and understand that there were no woods then. There might have been a couple trees, because this, we think, was an oak savanna area, but there wouldn't have been any other trees. So he came up with this image for us. We worked together with the local Prairie Island Indian community. Two of the elders there came over and helped guide this painting as he was doing it, so that we had everything historically accurate. And I don't know if you can, it's a bit far away, so I thought this would happen. So I created some of these things where I would take just a square like this and show a portion of it to help show you how it helps illustrate this story. So there's a guy with a bison scapula hoe coming home for lunch, and we figured this whole scene was probably late May in 1051 AD. That'd be about right, at about noon. So the two women over to the left have baskets, and they're coming back from doing the work of carrying the baskets, right, of dirt. And so this is just a way he wanted to squeeze in all the tools. And I said, well, don't show them actually creating pits, because we have a different image for that, but instead just exactly what he did. And it kind of is reminiscent of it's a chance to get a glimpse at daily life in a small way, because you get to see the fires in the background and the teepees in the background. And if you noticed in that image, there were clusters of teepees in different places, because we think people came from different villages. But meanwhile, when they're here, they had fires, and it's so windy, I think they did some of their fires just in the holes that were already available to get the fire out of the wind. The reason there's no people at that one is very specific. You can take chert before you finish making it, you can put it in the ground, bury it, and put sand above it in a fire, and you keep adding to the fire, and you heat it up. You get it up to a very hot temperature, but slowly, and then you let it cool very slowly. And when you finally pull it out of the ground 24 hours later, it's like glass. It's just like obsidian, and it makes it even better. This was already good chert for knapping and for making into tools, but it can be made even better that way. And so the reason we put that image there is that's exactly where Dan and I found some heat-treated chert flakes. So we know that they were heat-treating chert right at that spot. Here's another segment of it where we can see people having their lunch and telling stories around a fire. We can see the dogs. There would have been a lot of dogs, because they brought their dogs as they moved camps. The dogs carried the heavy bison hides and sometimes the poles, I guess, for each teepee. And they would carry these pretty much 70 to 80 miles. All of those villages I showed you are pretty much 70 to 80 miles away. And each of the teepees we know would have had paint on them, would have had designs, because that's what folks did. And you can see in this scatter of landscape, too, you can see the little gray blotches. Those are anvil stones and the chert debris around them. There's a ton of chert. When you start making tools, it just makes a huge mess and a lot of flakes. In that other site I mentioned that's 40 years ahead of us in research, they actually did a sample this wide from a stone, an anvil stone, about 3 feet out, and they made a circle and went straight down to see how many flakes they could find in that small amount of space. I'll let you silently guess. 45,000. So we have a big problem when we want to start excavating here, is what do you do with all that chert? Not all of which is useful. But when I mentioned that those teepees were around, I intentionally asked him to do that in different clusters because I think people came here from each of these places during the 7 or 8 months that it was easy digging, intentionally at the same time. They all had need for replenishing their toolkit in the spring before they went out hunting, and they all had reason to come here to do it because we know these folks were using a lot of Grand Meadow chert, not just for scrapers. We see other tools in their villages. But it's also important that no young person can meet a future mate where they live. They're related to everybody. These are small communities, and they have to go somewhere else to meet somebody. There needs to be a place to go. And since people were coming here anyway, once and even possibly twice a year to replenish their tools, before the spring hunt and maybe afterwards, but also before the fall hunt and maybe for the winter they get new ones. So at different times, but there would have been a great opportunity to meet here and share songs and recipes and stories and introduce folks to each other's kids. And then a few years later for Grandma to come, not traveling the 140 miles across, but just the 70 miles to come to this central meeting place to see the grandkids. So I have a strong feeling that if we were able to do the kind of necessary research, we'd be able to demonstrate that this was more than just a site for procuring stone, for getting the chert, but it was also a social site, social and cultural site of some importance. I also think that there's 2,000 holes there dug in just that time period, the 300 to 400 years, that this may have been the most visited place in all of southeastern Minnesota, possibly all of southern Minnesota. Really the most significant site of its time, and just a standout. So it's been a hidden story all this time, and it's really fun to bring it out and show it to people, and that's what we want to do. But I just am profoundly impacted having come to realize what we had here, which I didn't know when we first started. We were sort of shooting blind, but now as the stories are unfolding and the answers are coming, it's becoming more clear that that's true. And that Grand Meadow chert was probably the most important product to ever come out of this region until Spam. So I wanted to pause and see if there are any questions. I have a little more to tell you if you'd like to hear about what's coming up next at the site. Yes?
Can you explain the difference between chert and flint and obsidian?
Yeah, the question was the difference between chert and flint and obsidian. Chert and flint are essentially the same thing. They're just words used for the same thing. In fact, that big, beautiful knife I showed you when I was talking about chert is out of something we call Knife River flint out of North Dakota. But by and large, in the Americas, we say chert, and in Europe, they say flint. Obsidian isn't chert or flint. It's a wholly different thing made out of lava. And that hardened lava becomes just glassine and is really sharp. I mean, I have some of it, and it's just amazingly sharp for use. Another question, please.
So you talked about making tools and the supply of stone and the great need from Cahokia, and then you showed the picture of the woman who's scraping a hide.
Yes.
How long can she use that piece of stone as a tool before she has to sharpen it again?
The word
and make it smaller and then create more need.
Yeah, exactly. Which they would do as long as they could, and then have to go get a new piece of stone. And what a Dakota elder told her grandkids, who put it into the record for us, was that they would go through possibly 7 scrapers on one hide. So I wanted to, if I can take another moment, I also wanted to mention what's coming up. So that trail I said was going to be so impossible to build, we have built. There is a trail through there now. The blue is where it's handicapped accessible with vehicles, motorized vehicles. And so we have done that because so many of our visitors are coming from our native communities and our elders who use those. And so they specifically asked for that. We did the best we could. The brown parts are just for hiking. We managed to solve this problem going over all those odd places. And now we have this. This is the entrance area. We brought in some benches for folks, and this is a trail that was just laid last month. We haven't put the signage in yet, but we're preparing it now, and it'll be ready next May. People have already been coming from those communities and putting up special prayer ties, for instance, and tribute in the form of tobacco at the base of this area, which is near one of the places we show off, which is they call the grandfather tree, but an oak tree that's 500 years old. It's off in the distance behind this area. This is, after you've done about 2/3 of the tour, if you're a school class, for instance, this is a place for the teacher to pause and have the kids sit down and talk about what they think. So this is called the talking circle for whatever group is using it or whoever's happening to visit the site at any given time. It's going to be a self-guided walking tour, so nobody will be there to tell you what's going on. We're hoping the 12 signs we're making will carry you through the story. So they capture, in some way, most of what I'm telling you tonight in some form or another. How you have to, a knife or a scraper, what the tools look like, all that sort of things shows up in all of these different signs. And I mentioned, too, in terms of our great luck, the other phenomenally lucky thing about this site, blessed thing about this site, is that we've been able to get a yes from everybody. The first people I went to when I agreed to do this with the County Historical Society and some of the local county leaders was to say I can't go further without a Native partner. And I first went to Prairie Island. There's 4 Dakota communities in Minnesota that I could have chosen from. And I first went to the Dakota community at Prairie Island, and they just fell out of their chairs. Frankie, who was the leader there, just said, we've never seen anything like this. We have no idea anything about this. We have no idea what it is. And this is just amazing. How do we help? Even before I had a chance to ask. And so they've been with me on each of the 4 grants that I've gotten, legacy grants, to fund this. I have so far been the only white person who's ever gone to them and not asked for money from a casino community. And that's brought me some goodwill. And I've also then been able to incorporate the other descendant communities, the other communities whose ancestors probably dug holes here. And we have designed our interpretive program first and foremost for the youth of those communities. But it includes all 4 Dakota, the Iowa, and the Ho-Chunk. Those are all people who we could have passed through here, we know have passed through here at some time or another, and may have contributed to some of the activities going on at Grand Meadow Chert Quarry. The Ojibwa were never here. The Ojibwa were never into this area, but there's such good communications going on that it'd be a shame not to include them. And so I've got a Dakota THPO, which is the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. And so I've got one of their members involved in helping us be sure we're doing everything right to speak broadly to the Native community. And the rest of these are people that, some of whom, if you took them out of the equation, this wouldn't be here. And the grants came from the Minnesota DNR and the Minnesota Historical Society, legacy funds. And then we've also been receiving the generosity of donors because we're putting together an endowment fund soon in order to, well, now already, in order to sustain this site in perpetuity. So once we get the signs up, there's going to be some damage of some kind or another, wind or vandalism. And we know we'll replace them. We want to be able to have that happen without having to go raise money each time that occurs. So that's another piece of the good luck we have, is that all the folks in that list have been just invaluable to us. Any more questions?
So one of my questions was the fellow who identified it back in the 1950s. Who was he? I mean,
How did he know?
Yes, how did he know he hit something?
Good question. Because Maynard Green was a collector. He, as a little boy, found a cache of about 5,000-year-old spear points of gorgeous stone, not Grand Meadow Chert, in his home yard, in his home. He lived 4 miles north of this. And so that got him started as a rock collector and as an artifact collector. And he had collected, as I mentioned, many sites that he showed to the professor in the morning that day. He had collected and identified a lot of different sites, but had never had a good chance to share them with people. He didn't know a local archaeologist to talk to about it. But he kept reading and kept studying about it, and he knew there were quarries out there, and knew that people were having to pursue Chert in any way they could.
So was he elderly by the time you talked?
Yes, fortunately I met him. I mean, he's the one who walked me out there, as I say, and he was there through the 1990s, spearheading the effort to get permanent preservation for the site, protection. And so he tried to take it to the Minnesota legislature with the science museum professor, and that didn't work, but it's what was the necessary step to get the Archaeological Conservancy's attention to come by it, and especially once it was on the National Register. So what I hope is that people will walk away thinking it deserves to be on the National Register. And we're hoping to do more research in the coming 3 or 4 years. We're going after a large grant with legacy money to initiate a multi-level research plan with different organizations, with Hamline University and Mankato State University.
My other question,
oh, go
and
ahead.
then if anybody else has something, but since I have the microphone. So usually, I've worked on, helped out on a couple digs, and, so you're digging for people who stayed, in sites and to find the evidence. And here you've got, a real magnificent other thing to look at, but you were talking about the people who would have come in and been staying there. So has there been any discussion on trying to find where some of the people camped and what time period maybe it would have been?
Very much so. So the Hamline is doing that survey now, and not looking necessarily for pits, but looking for where people might have lived by going out across those riverine systems, those river banks, and looking just next to them for campsites. And what we've been finding is that it's a never-ending stream of them. And it is hard to sort out what time period we're talking about, because we're especially interested in the most recent ones, closest to the top, the Mississippian era, but we're interested in whatever was going on there through the past. So, but what shows up at the top of the plow zone right now in these plowed fields is probably most closely related to this time period. But it doesn't, and some of it does show evidence of campsites, not villages. We have one village we're aware of that we may be able to get at, but it's a surprising discovery that just happened. Another thing we're lucky about. This is a map from 1837 that was made by a Dakota elder going to Washington to prove to the Washington folks that Iowa should belong to the Iowa. And to prove it, he said, here, these are all our villages, these are all our trails, this is our land around all these rivers. And he drew this map, which is totally incomprehensible, but it's the way Native Americans think about showing the landscape. I mean, they would draw maps in the ground and such. It turned out that a team in Wisconsin and a team in Iowa got together and geo-referenced this. They figured out how to see how close to being right he was. And so they actually took his sense of rivers and river junctions and they laid them against the rivers of this area, and they showed up true. They were able to figure out exactly which rivers are on his map and where the trails went in relation to them and where the towns went. And there was one particular trail he showed that came out of central Iowa and came up past the Pipestone Quarry, back down into Iowa, not straight across, but back down in order to go specifically to villages. See, they're very social people. Their trails were about visiting each other. And so they went down to Village F and Village E, which we know where they are. There's been the little red triangles are excavations. We know what those are. And Village D, we've never heard of, never seen it before. And the trail there goes right by the Grand Meadow Chert Quarry and down over to the villages we know in northeastern Iowa. Well, that is the leading thing I'm interested in finding out this coming spring is there evidence in Austin for a large Native American village at the time that this map was being drawn, the time this map represents, which would have been around the 1400s. So still while the Chert Quarry was active. So it's going to be fun to see. But on the version of his map that shows the river, and on the georeference version, you see the Cedar River. You know that's definitely Austin.
Thank you, and I appreciate everybody's time. Perhaps we should adjourn at this point, and if you have any questions specifically for him, does that sound good?
And please do come up. I brought a piece I was going to send around, and instead I'm holding it in my hand. But if you're welcome to come up and hold it and see what it's like. This is a beautiful knife made out of Grand Meadow Chert. Just to show the style and the complexity of the manufacturing of these kinds of tools.
Is that one you said you keep in your pocket?
No, that one's too big. The one in my pocket is smaller, and I just use it for opening Amazon boxes.
And if you ever run it?
This is the one that it is just perfect edge on one side, and I haven't had to resharpen it yet, fortunately, because I don't know how. I'll stay up here if anyone has any more questions about it or any ideas you might have for us about how to think about the Grand Meadow Chert Quarry.